We are in London with Donnachadh McCarthy, who was a deputy chairman of Liberal Democrats. Now you are independent, you don't belong to any party, but you are a supporter of environmental issues. And you wrote a book about the Prostitute State. So you say that the British state is acting on behalf of lobbies, on behalf of private interests of oligarchies, and it has been somehow sold by politicians to this private interest.
Yeah, I spent 12 years in mainstream politics. I was deputy chair of the party for 2 years, on the board for 7 years. And after that time, one of my aims was to, as a passionate environmentalist, I was hoping the Liberal Democrats would be a vehicle to challenge the lack of action in Britain on climate protection. But when I was in the party, I came across a significant amount of what I call corruption. What I mean by that is large donors were buying seats in the Lords from the party, the way the party was funded by large corporations, and most significantly, the amount of corporate lobbyists who were around the leadership. So we had lobbyists both in the party's committees, in the party's advisors, and most importantly, even in the party's parliamentary party in the Lords. And what happens is that when MPs are a step down from being in Parliament, the skill that they've got is they know how Parliament works. But it's not the poor people in Peckham who have the money to hire them, it's the corporations who hire them, because they've got the millions to spend on buying their expertise and knowledge how Parliament works, their knowledge of the people, the knowledge of civil servants. And so that acts to completely distort the agenda of our Parliament, because what happens is that the access to Parliament is restricted really to the rich. And so that, in my mind, is a disaster, because over the last 40 years, we've seen the agenda move significantly to the right. So we've become a corporate, what I call a prostitute state. And that's just one pillar of it.
So, if I understand well, an MP, when he finishes his political career, he has another career in corporations?
That's correct. You can earn anything from 80,000 to $500,000, depending on whether you're a government minister, a prime minister. A prime minister earns 10 million a year, something like that.
But this is an award for what?
For contacts. It's that they know the people, they know the system. So they have inside knowledge of how civil service works, how government regulation works, how the legislative process works. So if you are a corporation, you want the government's laws to suit you, or the tax laws, for instance, you buy their expertise and then they're able to lobby and inform you and lobby the people inside government on your behalf.
Or maybe this is also an award for what these people have done, or some of these people have done during their office for the corporations?
Not necessarily. More often than not, no, it's more straightforward buying expertise and inside knowledge and contacts. There may be some situations where, for example, in the European Commission, or where people may have been compromised by their job in their department. It doesn't look good when a minister moves straight from awarding a contract to an arms dealer or an arms corporation and then moves into their board 6 months later.
About the politics and not only, are social classes open now in Britain or not? So, for example, Sadiq Khan, who is the mayor of London, is the son of a bus driver, is an exception, or there are many other cases?
When he was going to college, college tuition was free. And so that generation of politicians, there is a larger number of those people who have managed to get into the system and get up through the ladder. But the point of the thesis behind the prostitute state is that a lot of the power doesn't lie with the politician. It lies with the corporations, and more importantly, the second pillar of the prostitute state, which is our prostituted media. In the United Kingdom, around 5 far-right extremist billionaires own our media. Something like 80% of newspapers, they own book companies, they own the press agencies, they own TV companies, they own radio stations. So almost everything you're listening to, speaking to, or reading.
So why is not people able to organize to create an alternative? If
you control access to information, you control the agenda. So in Britain, even though it was public knowledge, for example, we were speaking earlier about the Iraq War, it was public knowledge that the neocons who had controlled the Bush administration were very open that they wanted to topple Hussein for the oil interests of America. But the media creates an atmosphere that to speak of that is outside the pale. So if you control the agenda and access to information, it's very challenging for the population at large to organise to regain the power.
This is the first carbon negative home in London. How is this problem, the political problem you have explained us now, affecting the environment?
The fact that they actually can buy the extraordinary access that the oil industry has to the government processes is mind-blowing. For example, Nick Clegg, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, was a lobbyist for the oil and gas industry. Vincent Cable, who was the party's Secretary of State for Business, was the chief economist for Shell Oil. The government's head of the civil service, the new director of the civil service, comes from the fracking industry. The government's chief director, of who appoints people to all the boards of government, comes from the oil and fracking industry. So, for example, Shell regularly organises workshops for government ministers, for government departments, internally inside the government, where no group like Greenpeace would have access to working with civil servants that way. So basically it's almost an oligarchy. Not an oligarchy, an oligarchy in the United Kingdom. And so what that means, of course, is that all of the legislation and the power, so the government is throwing all its weight behind fracking and actually putting a brake on all the action on climate change. So, but if you take a step back, why is that allowed to happen? And I would argue, go back to the second pillar. The fact that that is going ahead. So, for example, the government has introduced taxation on renewable energy. It's introduced a climate change tax on renewable energy. A complete farce. But nobody in the public knows about it because the media doesn't tell them. And so I believe, as having gone through this 12 years of politics, that the top political challenge in the United Kingdom is to challenge these people. And so I've set up an organisation called Advertising Action Climate Project, which is launching a campaign called Climate De-Advertisement Campaign, whose aim is to persuade those corporations that believe in climate change to stop advertising with the climate skeptic propagandist newspapers in the United Kingdom, because that's the only place we can achieve change politically in this issue, in my opinion.
How powerful is in Britain the Saudi monarchy, the influence of Saudi monarchy?
It's quite chilling, actually, the power it has. I mean, as we know, the Saudi regime has an appalling human rights record, which this government continues to sell arms to, contravening its own human rights regulations. The British aerospace was involved in very high level of corruption through the Thatcherite Al-Yamama deal, multi-billion pound project involving the Prime Minister's son, who got rich out of it. And when the corruption on this was just about to be dealt with by the fraud office, and the documents were to be released by Switzerland, the Prime Minister stepped in and closed the whole investigation down, despite the fact the United Kingdom has signed up to anti-corruption international treaties. That is how powerful the Saudi royalty family was, because they were likely to be involved in the scandal.
What do you think about Tony Blair and especially Iraq war? Now there is this report, and maybe there could be, in theory, there could be consequences for him.
Well, I very much hope to see him either at the bar of the House of Commons, held in contempt of the House of Commons, or that the families of the Iraq war veterans manage to take him to court. Because unfortunately, the legislation doesn't allow us to take him to the International Criminal Court in The Hague. It's very clear from the Chilcot report that he misled the country, he misled his government, he misled Parliament. He had done a deal with George Bush that, come whatever, Britain was going to back the invasion of Iraq, no matter what the United Nations said, or no matter whether they found weapons of mass destruction or not. The whole thing was a scam, because Blair was determined to go with Bush. Now, you ask yourself why? And I think you have to go back to the very origins of Tony Blair's power in the United Kingdom, which was a deal he did with Murdoch. In 1996, Murdoch flew out to Hayman Island in Australia and had a negotiation with Murdoch and did a deal with Murdoch. And the deal was Blair would not tackle cross-media ownership, would allow Murdoch to own more of the media in the United Kingdom than the Tories would at the time under John Major. So Murdoch backed Blair's election as Prime Minister. Blair sold the soul of the Labour Party. logical consequence of that is if you sell your soul, you're in hock with the devil. And Murdoch was determined to have the Iraq invasion, and he lobbied Blair phenomenally hard to invade Iraq with Bush. And that's, to my mind, not just scandal, it's a war crime.
But also the Tories did not oppose that war.
That's correct. The official opposition didn't oppose it. You have to remember, historically in Britain, parties that opposed the government going to war were normally trashed by the media and sometimes wiped out almost. So taking a stand against war has historically been seen as political dynamite. So as Deputy Chair of the Lib Dems, I was passionately against the war, and I campaigned very hard to ensure our party and our party leader was put off the fence and opposed the war. And that proved, I'm very proud that we did. We did oppose the war, we voted in Parliament against it, and it didn't result in us being wiped out as political force.
And this was a victory of yours?
I felt I contributed a lot towards it. Obviously, no victory in politics is ever down to one person. It was a group campaign, but I led the campaign to ensure the party opposed the war, ensure that Kennedy voted against the war in the end. But I feel very proud of what we did is that we set a precedent of a political party opposing war, and it survived. In my view, that allowed the subsequent vote 10 years later on Syria for the major opposition, the Labour Party then, to actually oppose the war. So it is now, in my view, a positive achievement that political parties can take honest opinions about war in British Parliament.
And finally, about refugees. There are also refugees which are escaping from climate change, were, however, partly forced to leave their country because of climate change. And someone said that also in Syria the war broke out after problems of agricultural problems may be caused by climate change.
Yes, a number of international experts believe that there was a massive prolonged drought in the Syrian countryside that led to massive fleeing from the land into the big cities, and the Syrian regime wasn't able to cope with the consequences. However, added to that mix was ISIS, which again evolved out of the American UK invasion of Iraq. So those two things together has led to absolute devastation in Syria, which is heartbreaking. Ironic, of course, is that those refugees have been fleeing to Europe, and then Britain pulls out of the European Union because we don't want refugees. I mean, this is totally morally bankrupt. We create a massive problem for the European Union, we destabilise it, and then we say bye-bye. Shocking.
Last question. Is there any politician now in Britain, prominent politician, who is outside the lobbies?
Yeah, actually, since I wrote the book, two positive things have emerged. Tim Farron in the Liberal Democrats, it was not from the political lobbying classes, which is unusual. And secondly, Jeremy Corbyn, at the leader of the Labour Party, is not from the lobbying classes. So interestingly, the two opposition parties at the moment, for the first time in decades, are not led by the lobbying political classes. And I think that's why, in many ways, Corbyn is absolutely receiving, from the Blairites in the centre-left, right through the Tories, the entire billionaire media are absolutely out to destroy him, because he represents a threat to the prostitute state. The only reason I think he's so successful is that the younger generation don't read the mainstream billionaire media. They get their news online, and so those people are absolutely adamant that we have to get the billionaire class out of our politics and to get the corporate lobbying classes out, and that's where Corbyn's, in my view, enthusiastic base is. And so interesting times, we have the parliamentary parties sourced in the political lobbying prostitute state, and the membership of the Labour Party not involved in it, and that's what the clash is happening at the moment.